During the ancient Roman Empire, many men wrote their names in the eternity of history. Some will be remembered as brave and astute commanders. Others earned fame for their cruelty and cowardice. But one name still echoes century after century: Gaius Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was born on July 13, 100 BC. As a child, Caesar already proved himself as an adventurer, as he was an active and good-spirited boy. But at just 16, his life changed abruptly. His father passed away, and Julius suddenly became the head of his family. Julius was the nephew of Gaius Marius, a great general and politician. He became famous for his military victories and for reorganizing the model of the Roman legions. Marius was known for his magnetic personality. Also, he was immensely respected by the soldiers who fought alongside him. That influenced the character of the young Julius Caesar, who saw in his uncle a model to be followed. But during Julius's adolescence, his uncle waged a civil war against ambitious Lucius Cornelius Sulla. They fought for the control of the city of Rome. In the midst of this civil war, Julius Caesar married the daughter of his uncle's political ally. His beloved's name was Cornelia Cinna. Together, they had a daughter named Julia. Marius lost his life during a battle, and Cornelius Sulla assumed the position of dictator, something that placed him above the Roman laws, with almost absolute power in the city. Although Julius Caesar had no direct involvement in the conflict, he felt threatened by the new dictator and his uncle's executioner. Seeing no other alternative, and in an attempt to get away from Rome as quickly as possible, Julius enlisted in the army, where he fought in distant Turkey. Julius served in the army with great prominence, even receiving the civic crown as a reward for his heroic acts. He was promptly recognized by his superiors and veteran soldiers, showing a promising future as a military commander. But in 78 BC, Julius received the news that his rival had died. Cornelius Sulla had died suddenly. For Julius Caesar, that meant a chance to come home. After fulfilling his contract in the army, Julius returned to his home. However, to his misfortune, his inheritance had been confiscated by Sulla's abusive government. To survive, Caesar used his powerful voice and his oratory skills to become a successful lawyer. And by working hard, Julius Caesar was able to rebuild his family's social status. When Julius was about 25, he traveled across the Aegean Sea. The vessel was attacked by pirates, and the largest of the crew was killed. The few survivors were captured to be sold as slaves. And for those born into wealthy families, a high ransom was demanded. Further away from home, and in a desperate situation, the future seemed uncertain and bleak for Julius Caesar. The days passed slowly while Julius Caesar was kept as a prisoner on a pirate ship. When the pirates discovered that Julius was part of a wealthy family, they demanded a lot of money to free him. The pirates demanded plenty of silver coins in exchange for Julius's life. At the time, it was considered an absurd price. But Julius Caesar was always a proud and fearless man. He told the pirates that they should demand even more coins in exchange for his life. But he warned that as soon as he was free, he would travel the seas to get back at them. The pirates mocked Julius. Throughout the journey, they ridiculed his arrogance. But at last, they accepted his cash offer. When he was finally free, Julius used his oratory gifts to attract sailors and warriors to his cause. And using the rest of his fortune, he set up a fleet of ships. Caesar spent several months sailing and facing pirate ships. His victories allowed him to make a profit by plundering the captured ships. When Julius finally found the pirates who had kidnapped him, he defeated them in battle and had the survivors crucified. The pirates paid a high price for mocking Julius Caesar. That increased Caesar's fame. His name was already popular on the streets of Rome. When he returned home, he was summoned into the army. Again, he left to fight in foreign lands. Julius stood out again on the battlefields, thus conquering the position of military tribune. This guaranteed him the right to command many soldiers and run for political office. Julius Caesar returned to Rome in 69 BC. That year he began his political career, taking up a new post in the Roman Senate. His wife Cornelia had become pregnant again. Everything in Caesar's life seemed peaceful. But to Julius's misfortune, his beloved wife died that year due to a birth filled with complications that stole her life and that of her baby. Shortly after his wife's funeral, Julius was sent to serve militarily in Spain. He was the administrator of the territories controlled by Rome. One day, Julius decided to get to know the city of Cadiz better, where he was living. After traveling some distance, he found a statue already worn out by time. When Julius approached, he noticed that it was a statue of Alexander the Great. As he approached the feet of the statue, Caesar felt an enormous torment and began crying. He was already 33 years old. He felt he had not conquered anything great in his life yet. On the contrary, Alexander the Great at that age had already conquered an empire. At that moment, Caesar swore he would not rest until he was equal to Alexander in his conquests. Julius Caesar fulfilled his role in Spain. He gained fame as a good governor and subdued 2 local tribes who had revolted against the Roman occupation. But Caesar was not happy to spend so much time away from Rome. After completing his service in Spain, he returned to his hometown. Upon his return to Rome, Julius focused his efforts on achieving new political positions. Julius wanted to be Pontifex Maximus, the highest priest of the Roman religion. But he was running against 2 other reputable senators. To support the campaign, Caesar spent most of his personal fortune. Julius Caesar knew he could not fail to win this new position. If he failed, his political career would be over, and he would be broke for the rest of his life. To get around this problem, Julius allied himself with Marcus Licinius Crassus, known for being the richest man in Rome. Crassus paid off half of Julius Caesar's debt and secured the remainder, proving to be a valuable ally. Julius was able to win the election and take on the position he had hoped for, but he needed to pay off a huge debt to Marcus Crassus. That alliance was not ignored by other powerful men. General Pompey had importance in the Roman Senate. He was respected and even feared by other senators. Pompey did not like Julius Caesar's growing ambition. He started watching that man, who seemed to stand out from the crowd. The years have passed. In 60 BC, Caesar was elected consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. As a consul, Julius Caesar obtained great authority in the city of Rome, to the point where he could even be immune from the laws of the city and be acquitted of any criminal charge. Caesar won the election again, and as consul, he proved to be a dangerously ambitious man. That year, Julius married Calpurnia, who would be his wife for the rest of his life. General Pompey publicly showed his aversion to Julius Caesar, and also his discontent with Marcus Crassus. To solve this issue, Julius met with Pompey and Crassus to form a new political and military alliance. This alliance became known as the First Triumvirate, in which the 3 most powerful men of Rome would work together to rule Rome. Pompey increased the number of soldiers on the streets of the city, providing more security to the population. Crassus bought a large naval fleet and wanted to establish trade routes in distant lands, such as Syria and Egypt, increasing his personal wealth and bringing new products to the demanding Roman markets. And Caesar took the military command to conquer new lands for Rome. Julius Caesar's fortune seemed promising again. He would not waste the opportunity to immortalize his name in history. Julius Caesar was elected to the post of Roman consul, gaining great authority in all the territories conquered by Rome. But to achieve such an important position, Julius Caesar needed to incur a gigantic debt to Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Caesar had not yet forgotten that day at the foot of the statue of Alexander the Great. The desire to match Alexander in his conquests was still alive in Julius Caesar's heart. the best way to achieve his goals was to conquer new territories for Rome, thus confiscating the riches and receiving part of the taxes of the conquered cities and villages. It was there that Julius Caesar focused his attention on Gaul. Gaul was an ancient region, classified by the Romans, comprising territories where France, Belgium, and part of Italy and Germany are located today. For the most part, Gaul was a wild territory, full of forests and inhabited by several very hostile Celtic tribes. With these obstacles, Gaul was not easy to invade, much less to conquer. Because it was a difficult task, Julius Caesar made Gaul the main target of his ambitions. In April 58 BC, Caesar marched towards Gaul in command of 4 legions, some 24,000 soldiers. Julius knew he could not simply enter the Gaul territories. It was necessary to plan his actions carefully, otherwise he would lose everything for which he fought so long to conquer. Despite its apparent military strength, Gaul was divided into several kingdoms, which were constantly fighting each other. These kingdoms were commanded by tribal chiefs or self-proclaimed kings. They often declared wars to conquer new agricultural lands, or to avenge old blood feuds between tribes. Taking advantage of this instability, Julius Caesar sent emissaries to talk with the leaders of the different tribes, seeking to establish political and military alliances. In his letters, Julius offered the military support of his legions in exchange for permission to enter Gaul territory and food provisions for his soldiers. The first alliances were quickly formed, and Caesar finally entered Gaul. The first conflict between Caesar's legions and the Gauls took place at the Battle of Bibracte, where the Romans found a far greater number of enemies. The Gauls were part of the Helvetians tribe, who were migrating in Gaul, attacking other tribes and leaving a trail of destruction. Julius Caesar organized part of his legions on top of a hill, gaining a strategic position against the Gauls. The other parts of the legions were hidden on another hill, covered by trees. The Roman legions managed to stop the Gauls' initial advance. It was the start of a long and arduous struggle that would last almost a whole day. At the ideal moment, Julius ordered the hidden legions to attack the rear of the Gaul army. The Gauls resisted for some time, but the discipline and determination of the Roman legions defeated the numerical advantage of their enemies. The Helvetians surrendered. Julius allowed many to be freed, provided they returned to their lands and agreed to work the crops to feed the legions. Others were not so lucky. They were sent as prisoners to Rome, where they would be sold as slaves. This heroic victory marked the beginning of several conquests in Gaul. Soon after, Caesar and his legions fought the Germanic tribe of the Suevi and achieved another major victory. In the years that followed, Julius Caesar continued to advance in Gaul territory, establishing new alliances, subduing tribes, or, when necessary, destroying cities and settlements. Obviously, the Gauls did not peacefully accept the Roman occupation. At times, some tribes rebelled, which provoked new battles. After suffocating a rebellion by the Belgian tribe in 55 BC, Gaul had been almost completely conquered by Julius Caesar. Caesar had accumulated enough wealth to pay his debt to Crassus, and after that, he would have enough to live in peace. His term as consul was also nearing its end. After that, he would have to return to Rome. But that year, one of his legions in northern Gaul sighted a strange island on the horizon. That island was Britain. Caesar had already read about the existence of that island in ancient Greek manuscripts. Upon learning of its location, he again felt the ambition and desire to reach where no other Roman had been. To cross the sea and reach Great Britain, Julius Caesar needed 2 things: boats to transport the soldiers, and time. Caesar ordered the construction of some boats, whose completion would take many months. Impatient with the slow progress in the construction of the boats, Caesar decided to take a risk. Only part of his legions would cross the sea to build a fortified camp. But he did not anticipate the disaster that eventually occurred, for that region is often affected by storms. During the crossing, a strong storm pushed the Roman ships against the cliff rocks. The few survivors who reached the beach were surprised by the Breton war chariots and retreated to their boats. This defeat did not affect Julius Caesar's resolve. but it took him a long time to get the necessary votes. In 54 BC, Julius Caesar finally arrived in Great Britain, where he initially set up a fortified camp near the beach. The Bretons did not peacefully accept the Roman occupation. Caesar spent over a year in Britain, warring and subduing the numerous tribes of that territory. This new conquest further enhanced Julius Caesar's reputation. The people in the city of Rome extolled his accomplishments, which concerned even more some members of the Roman Senate. During the time Julius Caesar spent in Brittany, new problems began to arise in Gaul. Tribal leaders asked their warriors to gather and expel the Romans from Gaul. Caesar knew this threat was serious. If Gaul united under a single flag, it would be virtually impossible to recover the conquered territories. One of those insurgent leaders was the famous Vercingetorix, prince of the Arvinus tribe. Vercingetorix was able to bring together many tribal chiefs and warriors under his command to attack the Roman garrisons in Gaul. When Caesar returned to Gaul, Vercingetorix was forced to retreat to avoid a direct confrontation with the Roman legions. In his escape through Gaul territory, Vercingetorix's troops destroyed everything in their path, burning villages and plantations to leave no food for the Romans. The strategy was working. The situation of Caesar's legions was not positive. Soldiers began to succumb due to hunger and effort caused by the long march. Julius Caesar again used his persuasion and began to intimidate and bribe the tribal chiefs who were not yet allies of Vercingetorix. Caesar managed to confiscate precious provisions to feed his soldiers and continue the pursuit of Vercingetorix. Some battles were fought along the way, and Julius Caesar proved his worth again by getting off his horse and joining his soldiers in the vanguard of the most chaotic battles. The legionaries felt an enormous pride and admiration for the general. Many fought to the end to defend Caesar's life and dreams. Finally, Vercingetorix was forced to retreat to the city of Alesia, built on top of a hill and a good place of defense against the Roman legions. The siege of Alesia was one of the most famous in history. Julius Caesar and Vercingetorix needed to make the most of their skills as commanders. Caesar surrounded the city of Alesia. He knew that if he tried to force his way into the city, it would cost the lives of many of his legionnaires. The other alternative was to force those inside the city to starve and thirst, forcing them to surrender. But Caesar did not have much time. He was aware of the approach of a Gaul army, whose mission was to rescue the inhabitants of Alesia. If this Gaul army arrived in time, Julius Caesar and his legions were surrounded by two enemy forces and would have no chance of victory. The solution was to build two wooden walls around the city. One would keep the inhabitants of the city trapped inside. The other would be able to contain the approaching army. The strategy was successful. When the Gaul army arrived, the Roman legions showed their worth again, defeating a far greater number of enemies. After witnessing this great victory, Vercingetorix surrendered to Julius Caesar. On a historic day, Vercingetorix proudly put on his armor and rode alone to the Roman camp. He stood face to face with Julius Caesar, and without saying a word, threw down his arms in a sign of Gaul's surrender. With the conquest of Gaul, Caesar achieved everything he had always desired. His name was admired and feared among the Romans. His wealth was vast. He felt ready to return triumphantly to the city of Rome. Julius Caesar performed the incredible feat of conquering Gaul, and even the Bretons on their distant island fell to their knees before the Roman military power. Many years had passed since Caesar left his beloved Rome, and he longed to return to his birthplace. However, many things changed during his absence. One of his most important allies, the consul Marcus Crassus, had his legions defeated during the dismal Battle of Carrhae, where the Romans encountered the powerful army of the Parthian Empire. Marcus Crassus was an outstanding merchant and negotiator, but his skills as a military commander were not as sharp as those of Julius Caesar and Pompey. Crassus perished in that battle, and with that, the triumvirate alliance was broken, allowing General Pompey to take political control of Rome. The emerging famous and wealth of Julius Caesar deeply concerned General Pompey, who, right from the beginning, already had a great contempt for him. Without the presence of Marcus Crassus to support Julius Caesar in the Roman Senate, General Pompey no longer saw any reason to tolerate Caesar's existence and began to make serious accusations against him. Pompey claimed that Julius Caesar had extended his campaign in Gaul for too long, whose original deadline was just 5 years. Pompey knew this was not true. He had secretly met with Marcus Crassus and Julius Caesar to decide the city's politics, and in this meeting, they agreed to give Caesar 5 more years to conquer Gaul. Another accusation was that Julius had used the strength of the legions for his own benefit and made his fortune in the Roman Senate. Pompey issued an order to Julius Caesar. He would have to disband his legions and return to Rome, where he would face a trial in the Senate. At that time, there were few in the Senate with enough courage to oppose Pompey's demands. Julius knew that, if he abided by that order, his life would be over, and everything would be lost. He then decided to march to Rome with his legions and demand respect, even if this had to be done by force. And so, in the year 49 BC, Julius Caesar and his legions were declared enemies of Rome, in an event that has been recorded in history as the Second Civil War of the Roman Republic. Caesar was not concerned when the news reached him. He already knew about Pompey's aversion to him, and a direct confrontation between the two was unavoidable. Julius Caesar found himself facing the sad reality that, in order to return home, he would have to attack his own city. Pompey was an experienced general and knew that Rome could not hold out long against the veteran legions of Gaul. He needed to amass more soldiers to defend the city, and to achieve this, he called in the legions that were serving in Greece and in the nearby territories. And a race against time then started. Pompey anxiously awaited the arrival of more soldiers, while Caesar marched as fast as possible to reach Rome before Pompey's reinforcements. To make Caesar's situation worse, he had the Rubicon River in his path. The Roman generals were expressly forbidden to cross the Rubicon with their legions on their way to Rome. Caesar knew that to cross the river meant no turning back path. In this context, Julius Caesar uttered one of his most renowned quotes, "Alia jacta est," luck is cast. Crossing the river with his legions would take a massive amount of time, and Caesar did not have that. He decided to take his chances and move forward with only one legion in a forced march. The other legions would follow immediately behind at a slower pace, preserving their strength for the upcoming battle. Both captains experienced anguishing days, but Caesar's legions again proved their worth and arrived in Italy with remarkable speed. Seeing no other alternative, Pompey gathered his personal guard and, together with some senators and allies, left the city of Rome shortly before Caesar's arrival. Pompey headed for the Roman city of Brundisium, from where he embarked for Greece, with the plan to meet with the local legions to set a counterattack against Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar finally entered the city gates, the streets were basically deserted. The Roman citizens were unsure of Caesar's intentions. Perhaps he would return as a hero, or, in alternative, as an enemy, seeking revenge for having been exiled from his city. But they had nothing to fear. Caesar did not allow his legionnaires to attack the population nor to plunder the city. When the weather in the city got milder, Caesar made a public speech, reassuring the population. He appointed one of his most trusted men to take charge of the city. The chosen one was Mark Antony, who had served with Julius in Gaul and proved himself as an excellent military commander. Caesar still had to wait some months to carry on with his persecution against Pompey. New boats had to be built to carry the legions across the sea. While the boats were being built, Caesar restored order to the city of Rome by passing new laws, electing new senators, and taking care of the city's financial affairs. Still waiting for the boats to be finished, Caesar went to Spain. There, he defeated Pompey's supporters, ensuring that Rome would not be attacked while he was heading for Greece. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar and Pompey finally fought their first conflict in the Battle of Dyrrhachium, which took place in a region in northwestern Greece. Much to Caesar's surprise, Pompey assembled a remarkable army of about 36,000 infantry soldiers and 7,000 knights. Julius Caesar feared that new reinforcements would arrive for Pompey. He decided to act quickly, setting up a fortified camp with only 22,000 men ready for the battle. The result was nothing short of disastrous for Caesar. Pompey attacked a weak point in the wooden wall that protected Caesar's camp, and the chaos spread quickly. With fewer soldiers and having his defenses compromised, Julius had no alternative but to order a total withdrawal. This defeat reminded Julius Caesar why Pompey the Great was one of the greatest generals of his time. He could not be underestimated again. Caesar retreated to a new camp, but had little food and drinking water for his men. With his provisions almost ending, Julius Caesar needed to act quickly. On August 9, 48 BC, the Battle of Pharsalus was fought in the region of Thessaly in central Greece. The fight got off to a slow start, with both generals carefully studying the opponent's movements. A fight between two Roman armies, trained with the same formations and tactics, could not have a simple conclusion. The battle was extremely aggressive. Both sides attempted to outflank their opponents. Pompey benefited from a larger cavalry, but Caesar's veterans had already faced all sorts of challenges and could not be easily dominated. Even being at a great numerical disadvantage, Caesar's legions managed to withstand the enemy cavalry and outflank the infantry, gaining total control of the battle. Pompey saw his army being destroyed before his eyes. He understood that he was not facing an ordinary man. Pompey was defeated and had to withdraw as quickly as possible. After that defeat, General Pompey found himself in a dreadful situation. Most of the senators who had left with him for Greece were now fleeing to other Roman colonies. Some even went to meet Caesar, begging for forgiveness. Pompey fled to Egypt, which, at the time, was part of the territories ruled by Rome. He sought refuge among the Egyptian nobility, but he did not expect a cruel twist of fate. Some members of the Egyptian elite feared that if they protected Pompey, they would be enticing Caesar's fury, who was already heading towards Egypt. Pompey was attacked and killed as soon as he set foot on Egyptian soil. A great Roman general had found an unglorified end in foreign lands. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, he was received at the royal palace of Ptolemy XIII. As soon as he asked about Pompey's whereabouts, only the remains of his former rival were handed to him. Caesar was enraged. He planned to forgive Pompey and bring him back to Rome. He would even allow him to occupy a seat in the Senate. The disrespect was even greater when considering that Pompey was a Roman consul and had been murdered cowardly by foreigners. It was too late for Pompey. Julius Caesar, now in Egypt, found himself a conspiracy target in the land of the pharaohs. The days were hot as usual in the Egyptian lands. Even for a Roman used to the demanding weather of the Roman Republic's capital, the Egyptian heat caused great discomfort. Also, the customs of that exotic people were nothing short of odd for Julius Caesar. After the long and exhausting persecution of Pompey, Julius Caesar and his soldiers needed a well-deserved break. With that intention, Caesar decided to spend a few days in Egypt, staying in the royal palace in Alexandria. In Rome, Caesar was elected to the position of dictator, the most powerful role in the Roman Republic. Caesar would remain in office for 1 year. Julius Caesar finally reached the top of his political and military career. However, peace never lasted long in Julius Caesar's life. In 48 BC, Egypt was going through a civil war. The renowned Cleopatra wanted to claim the royal throne from Ptolemy, her younger brother. Julius Caesar did not like Cleopatra's brother. After all, Ptolemy was one of those responsible for Pompey's death. Knowing this, Cleopatra started to devise a plan to meet Caesar. Using a creative plot, Cleopatra managed to enter Caesar's room. That unusual presence caught the attention of the Roman, and Cleopatra explained to him the political situation in Egypt. People claim that on that very night, Julius Caesar and Cleopatra became lovers. Caesar supported Cleopatra's ascension to the throne, securing the military support of her legions and fighting Ptolemy's troops. A sequence of battles was then fought, which became known as the Siege of Alexandria. Finally, Ptolemy was defeated in the deadly Battle of the Nile in 47 BC. This battle's key conflict was fought in the Nile waters, where Julius Caesar's war galleys faced Ptolemy's vessels. During the fight, Julius Caesar's ship eventually capsized, forcing the great Roman general to swim to the riverbank to save his own life. Ptolemy's boat also sank during the fight, but he was not so lucky. He drowned in the Nile. After this battle, Cleopatra took command of Egypt, and her romance with Julius Caesar was already the subject of much gossip and unhappiness in Rome. Mark Antony, in command of the city of Rome, was struggling to maintain political order and cover up Caesar's delay in returning to his Senate duties. And, even though he was a target of harsh criticism, Julius Caesar decided not to keep his romance a secret. He opted to bring Cleopatra to see Rome, something that was interpreted as a major insult by many noble Romans. Julius Caesar also traveled to the Middle East, where he obtained a landslide victory against King Pharnaces II's army. The victory against King Pharnaces II was so rapid and easy that it inspired Caesar to say one of his most famous quotes, "Veni, vidi, vici." I came, I saw, I conquered. Time passed, and the loving relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra caused great distrust among the Roman magistrates. Some rumors mentioned Cleopatra giving birth to a son of Julius Caesar. The couple's supposed son was named Ptolemy XV Caesarion. Nevertheless, Julius Caesar never officially recognized the child, although Cleopatra claimed that she was sure that Caesar was the father. Many senators started to fear that Julius Caesar was trying to make himself emperor, and by having a son with the mighty Queen of Egypt, he would be beginning a line of heirs with rights to command both the Roman and Egyptian territories. Also, some senators and Roman noblemen did not like Julius Caesar and were always looking for reasons to criticize him. Some of these senators were former supporters of Pompey. Although they had chosen the enemy side, they were forgiven by Caesar. To make things worse, during a festival known as Lupercalia, Mark Antony tried to crown Caesar's head with a golden diadem, typical of Greek kings. The gesture was supposed to be a joke, but this was interpreted as an insult by those at the party, even though Caesar tried to quickly remove the item. Julius Caesar did not seem to care much for the opinion of his opponents and started delegating political positions to friends and relatives. He also started to create laws that were approved without the senators' consent. Caesar kept augmenting his power and his sphere of influence in the city. Even with all his achievements, Caesar still wanted to start a new military campaign against the powerful Parthian Empire, which remained strong against every Roman onslaught. In 44 BC, the Roman Senate appointed Julius Caesar as perpetual dictator, guaranteeing him the right to hold office for the rest of his life. When he was 55 years old, Julius Caesar remained as ambitious as ever. This increased the fears of his opponents in the Senate, who began to devise a plan against the great general's life. The main supporter of the conspiracy against Caesar was Senator Gaius Cassius Longinus, who spared no effort to convince other senators to join his cause. On March 15, 44 BC, Julius Caesar went to the theater of Pompeii, where a session of the Roman Senate would take place. That same day, Mark Antony became aware of the plan against Caesar and ran to warn him of the impending danger. Upon entering the Senate, Caesar was amicably welcomed by the senators, among whom was his nephew, Marcus Brutus, for whom Caesar held in great esteem. In order not to arouse any suspicion, one of the senators handed over a parchment with a petition for Caesar to assess. The other senators walked to him, pretending to be interested in reading what was written. Then, the nearest senator drew a dagger that was hidden in his own cloak and grabbed Caesar's robe. Julius Caesar tried to dodge his attacker, but the senator started yelling for help, demanding the other members of the conspiracy to advance. Caesar was attacked by 60 senators, being mortally wounded by about 23 dagger wounds. One of the last to do it was his own nephew Marcus Brutus, who dealt the fatal blow. In an ironic touch of fate, Caesar fell at the feet of Pompey's statue. When he looked up, He saw the face of his nephew, and, with his last bit of strength, he pulled a part of his cloak to cover his face, avoiding the shame of looking into the traitor's eyes. Julius Caesar survived countless battles and challenges in his life, but now he lay motionless on the cold floor of the Roman Senate. There are no accurate accounts of Julius Caesar's last words. Some believe he said to his nephew, "Et tu, Brutus?" But this sentence was written by William Shakespeare and immortalized in the play in which he portrays Julius Caesar. But the writers Suetonius and Plutarch believe that Caesar did not say a single word at the moment of his death. After Caesar's assassination, most of the senators fled from the Senate, fearing they would be caught by the soldiers who were guarding the city. The conspirators believed that Caesar's death would bring the city's political power back into the hands of the Senate. However, they did not expect the emerging popular uprising. Caesar was seen as a hero by the majority of the population. When the news of his death spread, the citizens of Rome began to gather to protest against it. Julius Caesar's body was brought to be cremated in a public place. According to the tradition of the time, a massive number of people attended the ceremony, and as a farewell gesture, they threw wood and personal objects to the funeral pyre, causing the fire to rise to such an extent that it damaged the Senate building. The crowd ran after the conspirators Cassius and Brutus, who, amid that confusion, managed to flee to Greece. Brutus, perhaps consumed by regret, ended up committing suicide in 42 BC. Queen Cleopatra and her son Caesarion were in Rome at the time, but they returned to Egypt a few days after Julius Caesar's death. In a public square, Mark Antony read the will of Julius Caesar. He pointed out his great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, as his successor, and gave him the right to use the name Caesar. Gaius Octavius changed his name to Gaius Julius Caesar Octavius, and, a few years after his uncle's death, he was crowned as the first Roman emperor. The following Roman emperors began to include the surname Caesar in their own names. The great story of Julius Caesar came to an end, but the name of this remarkable man became synonymous with greatness.
In history, many people were born with noble titles and the right to command subjects and armies, but few have achieved true greatness, becoming legends whose names are perpetuated over the centuries. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of the most powerful men in the world. He had a complex personality and extraordinary willpower. He wanted to conquer a rich empire and make France the most important country in the world. Despite being an extremely important figure in French history, Napoleon's family was of Italian origin. His father's name was Carlo Maria Bonaparte, a descendant of a noble lineage that lived in the Tuscany region of Italy. His mother was Maria Letizia Ramolino, an austere and courageous woman who married only at the age of 14. She had a large offspring of 12 children, playing an influential role in Napoleon's upbringing and education. Christened as Napoleone di Buonaparte, he was born on August 15, 1769, in the city of Ajaccio, Corsica, an island that belonged to Italian rule but was annexed by France in 1768. At the age of 9, his family sent him to the French mainland, where Napoleon began his studies in a religious school. Shortly thereafter, he was transferred on a scholarship to a military academy in Brion-le-Château. For much of his youth, Napoleon was mocked by his peers because of his birthplace, short stature, manners, and his French with the typical Corsican accent. But Napoleon's short stature is a legend. This fame was created by English propagandists who intended to demoralize Napoleon's image on his rise to power. Although as a young man he was considered short for his age, as an adult, Napoleon was about 1.69 meters tall, a height considered normal by the standards of the time. Napoleon completed his studies at the famous Parisian École Militaire, becoming an artillery officer and the first Corsican student to achieve this feat. With the French Revolution in 1789, tensions between France and Corsica increased considerably, and Napoleon quickly returned to his hometown. By the age of 23, Napoleon participated in military uprisings, showing himself to be a fervent Corsican nationalist and defending his homeland's ideals of independence. His main mentor was the patriot Pasquale Paoli. The relationship between Napoleon and Paoli was troubled, as the latter considered Napoleon's late father a traitor after abandoning the cause of Corsican independence. The political differences between the two were growing, with Napoleon getting closer and closer to French revolutionary ideals. As a result of this estrangement, Napoleon was hampered during a French attack, which succeeded in invading Sardinia in 1792. He received confusing orders during the battle, being forced to retreat and abandoning his precious cannons on the battlefield. The orders originated from an officer chosen by Paoli. Napoleon's family became the target of political persecution in Corsica, which resulted in an attack on the Bonaparte home, destroyed by arsonists. Napoleon and his relatives fled Corsica for mainland France, where they settled in Toulon. This episode deeply hurt Napoleon, who began to harbor a grudge against Corsica and its inhabitants. This also caused him to definitely change his baptismal name at the age of 27, altering Napoleone di Bonaparte to the French version of the name, the famous Napoleon Bonaparte. Around 1792, France was in a very delicate situation. Several European powers such as the United Kingdom, Austria, Prussia, and Italy were at war with France. Meanwhile, the French Revolution was destabilizing the entire monarchical structure that governed the country. As the French Revolution took on new political overtones, civil war spread across France, with various political factions. In this chaos, Napoleon took part in a military action alongside the government, taking on some rebel towns in the French south. In 1793, Napoleon published a pro-republican pamphlet defending the ideas of the revolution. The strong words written by Napoleon eventually caught the attention of Maximilien Robespierre, the main leader of the Jacobin Party. Robespierre is famous for having been one of the most iconic and controversial rulers in history. His ideals of equality, liberty, and fraternity were in stark contrast to the rule of terror that he implemented in France. His radicalism fueled anti-democratic actions, persecutions, and assassinations of opponents. The rapprochement to Robespierre was quite beneficial to Napoleon, who became part of French politics, acquiring more and more influence in state affairs. During the siege of Toulon in 1793, Napoleon was appointed artillery commander of the Republican forces. His role was extremely important during the conflict, as he designed a plan to capture a hill where the Republican guns would be able to dominate the city's harbor, forcing the British and Spanish ships to retreat. The victory against the Anglo-Spanish troops, in addition to the capture of Toulon, caused Napoleon to become a brigadier general at the age of 24. A few months later, Napoleon was sent to command the troops on the border with Italy during the First Coalition War. Napoleon laid out the plans to attack the Kingdom of Sardinia, leading the French army to achieve victory at the Battle of Saorgio, April 1794. Napoleon and his troops fought further battles in the Alpes-Maritimes region, subduing other enemy towns and villages. But a twist of fate caught Napoleon by surprise, as the Jacobin leader Robespierre was arrested for his abuses of authority. He was guillotined in public on July 28, 1794. Robespierre's death and the rise of a new government triggered political persecution in France. Napoleon came under investigation for his association with the Jacobins. He was put under house arrest in Nice, on the southeastern coast of France. To escape this situation, Napoleon wrote a letter where he defended the legitimacy of his actions and good intentions for the future of France. He was acquitted of all charges and released on August 20th, 1794. During 1795, Napoleon's life went through several changes. He began his engagement to the young Désirée Claret, a passion that inspired him to write a romantic novella entitled Clisson et Eugénie, about a soldier and his mistress in a clear parallel between Napoleon and Désirée. But if his love life was going well, the same was not true for his military career. On September 15th, Napoleon was removed from his post as general. His pay was suspended for refusing to serve in the Vendée campaign. He faced a difficult financial situation and diminished career prospects. Napoleon regained some of his social status on October the 3rd, when the monarchists in Paris revolted against the National Convention. Napoleon was charged with commanding the forces to defend the Tuileries Palace, a task he accomplished with great efficiency. Napoleon's success suddenly gave him fame, wealth, and the patronage of the new government. Napoleon's new rise was also marked by a new romance with the beautiful Josephine de Beauharnais. Napoleon fell madly in love with Josephine, ending his relationship with Desiree by letter. Napoleon and Josephine's marriage took place on March the 9th, 1796. Just 2 days after the wedding, Napoleon left for a new military campaign in Italy. Highly superstitious, Napoleon believed that he was guided by a lucky star, which shone especially for him in the sky, manifesting itself in his life through his wife Josephine. Napoleon's beliefs made him increasingly confident and fearless, quickly advancing his troops on Italian soil, achieving many consecutive victories. In just 2 weeks, the Kingdom of Sardinia was subdued, and northern Italy came under French rule. There remained the Austrians in Napoleon's way, but even the numerous armies of the Holy Roman Empire did not stop the French. During this period, Napoleon began to become internationally famous. His name was exalted throughout France. The top military leaders of other countries feared his rapid rise, but not even Napoleon Bonaparte could have imagined how great his story would become. Napoleon Bonaparte's victories in his Italian campaigns greatly increased the prestige of the young French general. He collected many works of art of Italian origin as he ransacked several noble family homes. During his stay in Italy, Napoleon came to admire Italian sculptures and architecture. He sent statues, tapestries, and paintings to France, evidence of his military achievements. Some pieces were confiscated by Napoleon himself, who even sent valuable clothes and jewelry to his beloved Josephine. The passionate Napoleon always thought of his Josephine. He constantly sent romantic letters, whose contents made even the noblest ladies of French court sigh. In an excerpt from one of his letters, Napoleon wrote to Josephine, "You, to whom nature has given spirit, sweetness, and beauty, are the only one who can move and rule my heart. You know very well the absolute empire you exercise over it." But, to Napoleon's mortification, Josephine rarely answered his letters, and, when she did, she was dry and almost always distant. To complicate matters further, Josephine was involved in an extramarital relationship with a young hussar lieutenant. Napoleon was still in Italy when he learned of his wife's infidelity. He was so furious that he almost abandoned his military campaign to return to France. After this episode, Napoleon stops declaring his love for Josephine. Over the years, he had several mistresses. With Napoleon in command, the French won a decisive victory at the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797. The Austrians lost about 14,000 men, and because of the defeat, were driven out of Italian territory. That year, Napoleon and his troops went as far as Germany to attack the heart of the Austrian Empire. Napoleon's tactics were again superior in a succession of victories against the Austrian troops. After losing the Battle of Tarvis in March 1797, the Austrians realized that they couldn't hold Napoleon's advance. He was only 100 kilometers away from the city of Vienna. With no alternatives, the Austrians asked for a truce in a peace treaty. In some of his later conversations and interviews, Napoleon expressed his admiration for the great generals of the past, such as Hannibal Barca and Julius Caesar. Alexander the Great was his favorite, even adapting the Macedonian general's tactics to his artillery troops. One of Napoleon's favorite strategies was the classic pincer movement, engaging and surrounding enemy troops while moving his artillery pieces to support the infantry. In military campaigns that lasted just over a year, Napoleon became a national hero to the French people. He conquered most of northern Italy and the Netherlands and sent countless riches to France. For example, the precious Horses of St. Mark, 4 Byzantine bronze statues depicting horses. But not all French people were satisfied with Napoleon's exploits. His rapid rise made him more and more influential in French politics. Some monarchists made several accusations against Napoleon, claiming that he abused his power by plundering Italy. They warned that he might become a dictator. In response to the charges, on September the 4th, Napoleon sent General Pierre Augereau to Paris to lead a coup d'état and purge the monarchists. This event became known as the Coup of 18 Fructidor, which annulled many of the previous election results and removed the monarchists from political office. When Napoleon returned to France, he was charged with planning an invasion of Britain. However, he considered this approach too risky, as the British coastal defenses and navy would devastate the French forces. After 2 months of discussions and planning, Napoleon convinced the other French leaders to abort the invasion of Britain. Alternatively, he drew up new plans to dominate Egypt. Napoleon's military expedition to Egypt was primarily aimed at blocking the British from accessing the trade routes in India, taking away a valuable source of products and resources. To establish solid relations in the Middle East, Napoleon wanted to join forces with Tipu, the Sultan of Mysore, who was an enemy of the British. He also planned to establish relations with the Indian princes and, together with them, attack the British who had long oppressed the Indian people. Before leaving for Egypt, Napoleon was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences. He took with him a team of 167 scientists, including mathematicians, naturalists, and chemists. They traveled with the troops to conduct experiments and collect historical artifacts. Among the discoveries made by the French researchers was the famous Rosetta Stone, an important stone with 3 versions of a decree issued in Memphis during the Ptolemaic dynasty. The studies done with the Rosetta Stone were crucial to decipher the Egyptian hieroglyphs, making it possible to deepen the studies and understand how life, the beliefs, and the customs of ancient Egypt were. On his way to Egypt, Napoleon arrived on the island of Malta on June 9, 1798. Malta was controlled by the Order of the Knights Hospitallers, an important organization that took part in several wars during the Middle Ages and had a great prestige in Europe. But that did not stop Napoleon from demanding the submission of the territory. After token resistance by Grandmaster Ferdinand von Hompesch, the Knights surrendered and Napoleon captured an important naval base, losing only 3 men. On July the 1st, Napoleon landed in Alexandria. A few days later, the Battle of Shubra Khet took place on July the 13th against the Ottoman army, composed of Mamluk cavalry, the ruling military caste of Egypt. Napoleon won this battle by establishing infantry squares, a tactic that blocked the advance of enemy cavalry. French soldiers were able to fire their muskets in different directions and support nearby units. On July the 21st, the famous Battle of the Pyramids was fought, only 24 kilometers from the Pyramids of Giza, just outside Cairo. The battle was disastrous for the Mamluks, who lost about 2,000 warriors. On the other hand, Napoleon reported only 29 dead and 260 wounded in the French troops. This victory boosted the morale of the French army. But Napoleon's expeditions did not remain intact for long. On August the 1st, the British Royal Navy and the Navy of the French Republic fought a devastating naval battle in the Bay of Aboukir on the Mediterranean coast of the Nile River. The Battle of the Nile was considered arguably the most decisive naval confrontation of the Great Age of Sail and the most splendid and glorious success of the British Navy. The British remember it in various representations, including many drawings, paintings, poems, and plays. Even after this defeat, Napoleon did not leave Egypt. In early 1799, he ordered an army to advance into the Ottoman province of Damascus in Syria. Napoleon led 13,000 French soldiers in the conquest of the coastal cities of Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. In these conquests, Napoleon's brutal personality emerged, especially during the attack on Jaffa. He ordered the execution of a garrison of 1,400 prisoners by bayonet or drowning in order to save bullets. After an unsuccessful attack on the fortress of Acre, Napoleon guided his troops back to Egypt. But as the days progressed, he became increasingly impatient and ruthless, as many soldiers in his army suffered from an epidemic of bubonic plague. Dissatisfied with the slow pace of the march, Napoleon ordered that soldiers affected by the plague be poisoned with opium. The death toll remains a mystery. As many as 580 lives were lost. While fighting in Egypt, Napoleon received word that France had suffered several defeats to a new coalition of European countries, led by Britain and the Holy Roman Empire. This new wave of battles became known as the War of the Second Coalition. On August 24, 1799, Napoleon took advantage of the temporary departure of British ships from French coastal ports and headed for France, despite having received no explicit orders from Paris. His army remained in Egypt under the command of Jean-Baptiste Kleber. Napoleon arrived in Paris in October of that year and found a difficult situation. The Republic was bankrupt, and the leaders of the regime known as the Directory were considered ineffective and unpopular by the French population. Napoleon realized that he had to make a bold move, which could jeopardize his career and would forever change the history of his life. Napoleon's return stirred up the French population, which was deeply dissatisfied with the dictatorial rule of the Directory. This name derived from the executive power exercised by 5 members known as directors. Even though he suffered some defeats in Egypt, Napoleon returned as a hero and was acclaimed by the people. The Directory became concerned and even accused Napoleon of desertion for leaving Egypt without having received official orders to do so. The charges were unsuccessful due to the lack of support from politicians who were against the Directory. Napoleon formed an alliance with Lucien, his younger brother and president of the Council of 500, along with director Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and other allies. They overthrew the Directory in a coup d'etat on November 9, 1799, known as the Coup of Brumaire 18. This event is also considered by some historians to be the official end of the French Revolution. Napoleon and his allies formed a new political regime called the Consulate, where Napoleon was elected to the position of First Consul, obtaining dictator-like powers and control over the most important affairs of France. Concerned to legitimize his power, Napoleon drafted the Constitution of the Year 8 and secured his own election as First Consul, choosing the Tuileries Palace as his residence. The Constitution was approved in a fraudulent plebiscite, with 99% of the votes in favor. During Napoleon's time in Egypt, France had lost almost all the territories it had conquered in the War of the First Coalition. To reverse the situation, Napoleon set out again for northern Italy, where he faced Austrian armies. Inspired by the tactics of the famous general Hannibal Barca, Napoleon surprised his enemies by crossing the Swiss Alps and reaching Italy via an unexpected route. After a difficult crossing, the French army entered the plains of northern Italy without encountering much resistance from the enemy forces. On June 14, 1800, the Battle of Marengo took place. Napoleon commanded 24,000 troops against 30,000 Austrians. The Austrian forces had an apparent advantage, but the French lines never broke in their tactical retreat. Napoleon rode constantly among the troops, urging them to resist and fight. Near the end of the day, the French overcame General Michael von Melas's surprise attack, driving the Austrians out of Italy. In just 1 month, Napoleon forced the Austrians to sign a new peace treaty, finally consolidating his political position in Paris as First Consul of France. Napoleon's new position created a new wave of dangerous enemies, among them opponents belonging to the monarchist parties and Jacobin extremists who came to fear the man whose ambition seemed limitless. There are reports that Napoleon suffered several assassination attempts. The most famous occurred in Paris on the night of December 24, 1800. Napoleon was traveling toward the opera to see Joseph Haydn's oratorio when a carriage exploded on the street just as his carriage passed. Napoleon survived the bombing unharmed, although the explosion killed a dozen spectators. About 40 people were injured, and several buildings were damaged or destroyed. Police investigations found those responsible for making the bomb, who were executed on April 20th, 1801. After a decade of constant warfare, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens in March 1802, ending the Revolutionary Wars. With Europe at peace and the economy recovering, Napoleon's popularity reached its highest levels, and he was recognized at home and abroad. In January 1804, the French police discovered a new assassination plot against Napoleon that had the involvement of the Bourbon family, the former rulers of France. In retaliation, Napoleon ordered the kidnapping of Louis-Antoine de Bourbon, the Duke of Enghien. The Duke was quickly executed after a secret military trial, which angered royal courts throughout Europe. It was one of the political factors that contributed to the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon used this new assassination plot to justify the creation of an imperial regime based on the old Roman model. This would create a hereditary system for the Bonaparte family, who would have the right to rule France and the other conquered territories. Also, in 1804, Napoleon was elected Emperor of the French by a vote count of over 99%, with almost 3.6 million voters. This devotion of the French population to Napoleon is considered a rare event in human history. Napoleon's coronation, made official by Pope Pius VII, took place on December 2, 1804, at Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris. Napoleon entered the ceremony wearing the golden laurel wreath and kept it on his head throughout the proceedings, honoring the customs of the ancient Roman Empire. A second crown, a replica of Charlemagne's, was brought for the ceremony. This was symbolically raised above Napoleon's head, but placed on the head of his wife Josephine, making her Empress of all France. The following year, Napoleon was also crowned King of Italy, with the Iron Cross of Lombardy in Milan Cathedral on May 26, 1805. Among his generals, he chose 18 imperial marshals to ensure the loyalty of the French army. But the peaceful period had come to an end in Europe. Britain broke the peace treaty and allied itself with the Holy Roman Empire, Russia, Sweden, and Austria, starting the War of the Third Coalition. Napoleon knew that the French fleet could not defeat the British Royal Navy in a direct battle, so he planned to lure it away from the English Channel. The plan fell apart after the British victory at the Battle of Cape Finisterre in July 1805, where the French Navy was again torn apart by British ships. Realizing that he would have problems if the Austrians received reinforcements from the Russian armies, Napoleon moved his army to southern Germany. The Battle of Ulm took place between October 16th and 19th, 1805. The Battle of Ulm is generally considered a strategic masterpiece. Napoleon organized his troops to flank and surround enemy positions, forcing the surrender of Austrian General Karl Marx and capturing a total of 60,000 troops. The French exemplary performance in land battles was not shared by the French naval squadron, which suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Trafalgar on October 21st against the British Royal Navy. That was the last time the Royal Navy was seriously challenged by a French fleet during the Napoleonic Wars. After the Ulm campaign, French forces captured Vienna in November. The fall of Vienna provided the French with a huge reward, capturing 100,000 muskets, 500 cannons, and the unharmed bridges over the Danube River. On December 2nd, the Battle of Austerlitz was fought in Moravia. The battle is often considered a tactical example to be followed, given the near-perfect execution of a calibrated but still dangerous plan. With the same stature as the Battle of Cannae, fought by Hannibal Barca against Rome some 2,000 years earlier. The Allied disaster at Austerlitz significantly shook the faith of Emperor Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire. France and Britain again agreed to sign an armistice between the two powers. Napoleon even said, "The Battle of Austerlitz is the best of all those in which I have ever fought." After Austerlitz, Napoleon divided the conquered German states and established the Confederation of the Rhine, ending the Holy Roman Empire. The territorial reorganization eventually alarmed the Kingdom of Prussia, which felt threatened by the steady advance of the French. King Frederick William III of Prussia eventually gave in to the pleas of his wife and ministers, forming new alliances with Russia, Saxony, Sweden, and Great Britain. the War of the Fourth Coalition against Napoleon began. Napoleon invaded Prussia with 180,000 troops, marching rapidly on the right bank of the Saale River at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt on October 14th. The French quickly defeated the Prussians, who suffered heavy casualties. Several enemy commanders were killed or disabled. This victory was especially profitable for Napoleon's army. In 1 month, the French managed to capture over 2,000 cannons and hundreds of ammunition wagons. Then, Napoleon and his troops captured the city of Berlin, the capital of the Kingdom of Prussia. There was a huge plunder in the city, and Prussia became a client state of France, forced to pay large indemnities. While in the city, Napoleon visited the tomb of Frederick the Great, former King of Prussia. He repeatedly told his marshals, "Hats off, gentlemen. If he were alive, we would not be here today." In 1806, Napoleon sought to form new alliances in the Middle East. The Ottoman Emperor Selim III recognized Napoleon as an ally, as did King Ali Shah Qajar of the Persian Empire. But Napoleon was unable to form effective alliances due to the intervention of Britain and Russia, who declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon was now a living legend. Few would dare challenge his position as emperor or general on the battlefield. But his future would still have many twists and turns and great moments. Napoleon had come a long way since he left Corsica as a young man, facing memorable battles in many different settings where he challenged kings and generals and achieved many victories. Napoleon was now Emperor of France. Thus, he controlled much of continental Europe in the early 19th century. At its peak, the well-known First French Empire had 130 departments and ruled over 44 million subjects, with a huge military presence in Germany, Italy, Austria, and Prussia. France became an enviable military power, but there were still enemies capable of challenging its sovereignty. Among them were Great Britain and the giant Russian Empire, which constantly sent armies to Germany and Prussia to instigate revolts among the local population and drive the French out of the region. On November 21, 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, prohibiting European nations from trading with Great Britain. The goal was to hurt Britain's coffers and weaken its economy by creating the so-called Continental System. But the decree was not well received by the French-dominated European nations. The smuggling of goods grew exponentially, causing more economic problems for France than for Britain. In February 1807, the bloody and inconclusive Battle of Eylau took place in the East Prussian region, where Napoleon's large army faced the Imperial Russian army, commanded by the German-born general Levin von Bennigsen. Early in the battle, a frontal attack by Napoleon failed, with catastrophic losses. To reverse the situation, the emperor launched a massive cavalry charge against the Russians. This gave the French right flank enough time to organize and counterattack their enemies. The French forced the Russians to retreat after a night of combat, but the death toll on both sides was a high price to pay, and the myth of Napoleon's invincibility was badly shaken. According to estimates by German historians, the French suffered more than 29,000 casualties, either killed or seriously wounded. French revenge would come months later, on June the 14th, in the famous Battle of Friedland. Napoleon again faced General Bennigsen, but this time the French were prepared. With superior numbers, and faced with the vulnerability of the Russians who had their backs to the Alle River, Napoleon concluded that the moment had come and ordered a massive attack against the Russian left flank. The French attack pushed the Russian army back, pressing them against the river. Unable to withstand the pressure, the Russians broke their formations and began to flee down the river. Many drowned. The Russian army suffered terrible casualties at Friedland, losing over 40% of its soldiers on the battlefield. Napoleon's overwhelming victory was enough to conclude the War of the Fourth Coalition. Emperor Alexander I of Russia sought a peace negotiation and joined the Continental System against Great Britain. The treaties of Tilsit were created. The first one was signed by Napoleon and Alexander I at a meeting on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. The first thing Alexander said to Napoleon was, "I hate the English as much as you do." He probably wanted to fortify his ties with the French emperor. The second treaty was signed with Prussia on July the 9th. The lands lost by Prussia were converted into the new Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Jerome, Napoleon's brother. The humiliating treatment of Prussia at Tilsit fueled a deep and bitter antagonism, which grew worse as the Napoleonic era progressed. Napoleon continued his efforts to prevent countries on the European continent from trading with Britain, but the Kingdom of Portugal, headed by King John VI, defied French orders by resuming diplomatic and trade relations with the British. As punishment, Napoleon sent 24,000 French soldiers to invade Portugal, commanded by General Jean-Andoche Junot. The French had help from the Spanish, who had been looking for a pretext to wage war against the Portuguese. To escape the French, John VI, accompanied by the entire royal family and a large retinue of nobles, embarked for Brazil, abandoning the Portuguese people to their fate. To explain himself to the people, Joan ordered posters to be put up in the streets stating that his departure was inevitable, recommending that everyone remain calm and orderly and not resist the invaders. With Portugal secured, Napoleon focused his attention on the Kingdom of Spain, which was already his ally, but was showing ambition to expand its influence and could be a threat in the future. In 1808, Napoleonic France occupied Spain, and Napoleon placed his older brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. The Spanish people did not accept the French occupation peacefully, beginning the period of the Peninsular War, which lasted 6 years and significantly affected the French armies. French defeats at the Battle of Bailen and the Battle of Vimiero forced Napoleon to personally intervene in the fighting. Under the emperor's command, the French army inflicted several crushing defeats against the Spanish forces. On December 4th, 1808, Napoleon marched his 80,000 troops into the city of Madrid. The British, who were supporting the Spanish, quickly withdrew from Spain after one last resistance at the Battle of La Coruña in January 1809. Napoleon's empire was far from peaceful. That same year of 1809, the Austrians moved in for a new offensive against France. Early in the morning of April the 10th, the new Austrian army invaded Bavaria. The first Austrian attack surprised the French. Napoleon was still in Paris when he learned of the invasion. This was the beginning of the War of the Fifth Coalition. Napoleon came up with a plan to isolate the Austrians, winning a major victory at the Battle of Eckmühl. Then, the French marched into the city of Vienna, captured for the second time. Between May 21st and 22nd, the Battle of Aspern and Essling took place. It was quite violent, where the continuous Austrian artillery bombardment forced Napoleon to withdraw his forces. It was Napoleon's first defeat in a major battle, which caused excitement in many parts of Europe. It proved that he could be defeated in battle. After 6 weeks of planning, Napoleon commanded a new offensive in the biggest battle of his career so far, the Battle of Wagram. Napoleon crossed the Danube River with 172,000 troops during the night of July the 4th and attacked the Austrian army of 136,000 men. The French hit the right and center of the Austrian forces. The momentum of the battle changed, and Napoleon launched an offensive along the entire enemy line, which split in half and made the Austrian position untenable. The Austrians tried to retreat, but were pursued and defeated a few days later at the Battle of Znaim, where they surrendered and asked for an armistice, ending the war. With the end of the war, Napoleon returned to France, where he experienced a terrible dilemma. He needed an heir to take over the vast empire he had conquered, but during the entire time they were married, his wife Josephine did not bear him a single child. On January the 10th, 1810, Napoleon divorced Josephine and sought a new wife with a noble lineage. He found a beautiful 18-year-old candidate named Marie Louise, the Duchess of Parma and daughter of Emperor Francis II of Austria. To formalize the recent alliance with Austria through a family connection, Napoleon married Marie-Louise on April 1, 1810, making her the second Empress of the French. Marie lived up to her husband's expectations, giving birth to a baby boy on March 20, 1811, known as Napoleon II, and receiving the symbolic title of King of Rome. Napoleon's happiness at having an heir was overshadowed by a new threat from Eastern Europe. The Russian nobility demanded that Emperor Alexander I break his alliance with France. Tensions between the two powers increased with Russian violations of the continental system. Napoleon was informed that Russia was planning a new alliance with Britain and an invasion of Poland. Furious at the breach of the peace agreement signed at Tilsit, Napoleon expanded his army to a total of 450,000 men. Ignoring advice against an invasion into the Russian interior, he set out on a new campaign. Napoleon had achieved impressive victories against all adversaries who dared to challenge him, but the decision to invade Russia would bring unimaginable consequences for the French emperor. Napoleon spent much of his adult life on the battlefield, fighting many consecutive wars, and struggling to fulfill his dream of establishing a prosperous and lasting empire. To achieve his goals, Napoleon subdued kingdoms and empires across Europe, with countless lives lost in over 15 years of battles. But this time, Napoleon marched with his vast army into the heart of the mighty Russian Empire. Napoleon invaded Russia on June 24, 1812. To his surprise, he did not find any large army ready to face him in an open field battle. Instead, the Russian troops only made occasional attacks and retreated further and further into the country. There was fierce Russian resistance at the Battle of Smolensk between 16 and 18th of August. In this battle, French artillery mercilessly bombarded the city of Smolensk, destroying almost every building and burying thousands of people in smoking ruins. With over 15,000 casualties, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the invasion. Napoleon left Smolensk in flames and advanced with his army, but the Russians kept retreating. They chose the military strategy of scorched earth, the aim of which is to destroy anything that might be useful to the enemy, such as villages that might offer shelter or food crops. Food was increasingly scarce as the French army advanced into Russian territory. Supply lines had to travel many miles to reach the units on the front line. Men and horses suffered from hunger, and the weather became colder and colder as the days passed. On September 7, 1812, the Battle of Borodino was fought, one of the bloodiest battles in history. The Russian Imperial Army, commanded by Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, initially ordered the Russian troops to advance. But after suffering an attack from French artillery, he realized that their situation required a defensive rather than offensive posture. The battle was extremely tricky. Both sides lost soldiers due to artillery and muskets. Smoke created by musket fire took over the battle. The infantry and horsemen had difficulty maneuvering over the heaps of corpses and wounded. It was a horrible massacre even by Napoleonic standards. Although the French won, the cost in lives was very high. Napoleon himself gave this account of the battle. "The most terrible of all my battles. The French showed themselves worthy of victory, but the Russians showed themselves worthy of being invincible." The Russian forces retreated orderly to the south of Moscow. Kutuzov's initial plan was to wait for reinforcements and defend Moscow, but the rapid advance of the French army forced him to retreat beyond the city. Before Napoleon's arrival, Moscow was set on fire by order of Governor Fyodor Rostopchin. The fire spread for days, leaving the city in ruins on the arrival of the exhausted French. Napoleon entered the city, believing that the fall of Moscow would end the war, but the Russians kept him waiting. Due to a lack of food and proper shelter from the growing winter cold, Napoleon and his army withdrew from Moscow in early November. The most devastating effect of the cold weather on Napoleon's forces occurred during the retreat. Starvation and hypothermia led to the loss of tens of thousands of soldiers. Almost 10,000 men and horses froze to death in one night alone. To make matters worse, the rear of the weakened French army suffered constant attacks from Cossack horsemen who used guerrilla tactics to further undermine the French forces. Between November the 26th and the 29th, the Battle of Berezina took place. Although it ended with a narrow French victory, it was a decisive blow against Napoleon. He was forced to accelerate his withdrawal from Russia, abandoning 25 artillery pieces and several wagons with weapons and supplies looted by the Cossacks. Napoleon's Russian campaign came to an end with the disastrous result. Of more than 400,000 soldiers who had started the march at the beginning of the invasion, fewer than 40,000 returned to the territory of the French Empire. The Russians had lost 150,000 soldiers in battle and thousands of civilians. Napoleon's unsuccessful expedition into Russia fueled new conspiracies against his position as emperor and his life. France's former enemies such as Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain wasted no time and formed a new alliance with the support of Sweden, Spain, and Portugal. This was the beginning of the War of the Sixth Coalition, which started in March 1813. It was also known in Germany as the War of Liberation, because it finally removed the control that the French exercised over the German states. The situation of the Iberian Peninsula was not favorable for Napoleon either. The Peninsular War had continued to drag on since 1807. A union of the British, Portuguese, and Spanish armies was established, which defeated the French army under King Joseph Bonaparte. The clash became known as the Battle of Vittoria. Even though he was outnumbered, Napoleon did not surrender easily. He scored several important victories in Germany, such as the Battle of Dresden, but his enemies were multiplying and putting more and more pressure on the French forces. Between October 16th and 19th, the Great Battle of Leipzig took place, also called the Battle of Nations, because it was the biggest conflict of the Napoleonic Wars, with 500,000 soldiers and 2,200 pieces of artillery. It caused over 90,000 casualties in total, making it the largest battle in Europe before the First World War. The defeat at Leipzig was dangerous for Napoleon, destroying a second French army and severely damaging his reputation as a military genius. He returned to Paris at the end of the year. His first words as he entered the Senate were, "A year ago, all Europe marched with us. Today, all Europe marches against us." Visibly disturbed, Napoleon was showing signs of physical and mental exhaustion. His once haughty posture was increasingly bowed, and his face had a sorrowful, moody expression. Some said he had gone mad for power as he rejected the terms of peace in the Frankfurt proposals, where Napoleon would continue as Emperor of the French, but would be reduced to his natural borders. This meant that France could retain control of Belgium and the Rhineland, but should withdraw from all other territories. Napoleon's refusal prompted a new wave of battles, where the coalition won the majority. On the fateful 31st of March, 1814, the joint forces of Russia, Austria, and Prussia entered the city of Paris, forcing the surrender of the French and ending the War of the Sixth Coalition. Alexander I of Russia told the French Senate that the coalition allies were fighting Napoleon, not France, and were prepared to offer honorable peace terms if Napoleon was removed from power. The next day, the Senate passed the Act of Resignation of the Emperor, which deposed Napoleon. With no other alternatives, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne, signing the Treaty of Fontainebleau on April 11, 1814. With this treaty, the Allies ended Napoleon's rule as Emperor of the French and sent him to exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba. Napoleon was granted the right to command the island and retain his title of Emperor. But for a man who had once commanded much of Europe, being the emperor of a single island was unbearable humiliation. After a few months of exile, Napoleon learned that his former wife, Josephine, had died in France. He was devastated by the news, locking himself in his room and refusing to come out for 2 days. Unhappy at the prospect of spending the rest of his days in exile, Napoleon managed to round up 700 men and escape from Elba on a warship. Upon arriving on the French mainland, Napoleon was intercepted by the 5th Regiment, who had orders to capture the former emperor. Napoleon approached the regiment alone, dismounted from his horse, and, when he was within firing distance, shouted to the soldiers, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." Many of those soldiers had served Napoleon for many years and had great admiration for him. In a show of devotion, the soldiers promptly replied, "Long live the emperor." Napoleon arrived in Paris on March the 20th and ruled for a period known as the 100 Days Government. Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia promised to field 150,000 men to end his rule, which gave rise to the 100 Days War, also known as the War of the Seventh Coalition. By early June, Napoleon's armed forces had 200,000 men, and he decided to attack an open barrier between the approaching British and Prussian armies. The meeting of the armies took place on June the 18th, 1815, at the famous Battle of Waterloo. The coalition was led by the British under Arthur Wellesley, better known as the Duke of Wellington. The coalition allies resisted repeated French attacks during the day until Prussian troops arrived and attacked the French flank, inflicting heavy casualties. Napoleon still tried to launch a final offensive with battalions of the French Imperial Guard, but the Prussians attacked the French right flank. The British army repelled the Imperial Guard, definitively defeating the French. Waterloo was the last battle fought by Napoleon. On his return to Paris, he noticed that the legislature and the people had revolted against him. He again abdicated his post as emperor, now permanently, ending the First French Empire. The British exiled Napoleon to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean. They also decided to take precautions and sent a small garrison of soldiers to prevent any escape. Napoleon had as his last residence an old mansion called Longwood House, whose situation was precarious, with damp and mold on the walls. Napoleon's health worsened over the years. Some believe this was part in due to the unsanitary conditions of his house. Around February 1821, Napoleon realized that his life was nearing its end and sought to reconcile with the Catholic Church. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821, at Longwood House at the age of 51. In a later autopsy, the cause of his death was stomach cancer, probably originating from a suicide attempt when Napoleon, upon learning that he would be exiled to Elba, ingested a poison pill that did not have enough potency to kill him. Napoleon was buried in a Russian red quartzite sarcophagus. The tomb is in a complex of buildings called Les Invalides in Paris, where museums and monuments can be found, all related to the military history of France. Napoleon was responsible for spreading the values of the French Revolution in other countries, in particular legal reforms such as the Napoleonic Code, with its emphasis on clearly written and accessible laws. It was an important step in replacing old feudal laws. The code is still in force today with some amendments. Today, Napoleon's life is debated by scholars and politicians in all countries. He is seen as an enlightened and determined man by some. Others consider him megalomaniacal and power-hungry. But for much of his life, he was the most powerful man in the world. The ancient Romans conquered one of history's greatest empires. However, this empire was not built peacefully. Relying on their highly disciplined military system, the Romans fought wars against many kingdoms of different cultures and traditions. Many peoples of warrior cultures organized armies to fight the Latin invaders, but they failed to stand up to the Roman Republic, which seemed forever unsatisfied with the growing number of territories and cities under their rule. But Rome wasn't the only military and economic power on the rise. In North Africa, the great city of Carthage remained steady and sovereign in the control of the Mediterranean Sea trade routes. Carthage had been founded around 814 BC by Phoenician settlers, and within a short time, the city grew in strength and splendor. Over time, the Carthaginians founded other cities in Sicily and Sardinia and ruled the territories of other peoples who inhabited the African coastal region. The control that the Carthaginians exercised over the Mediterranean Sea greatly affected the progress of the Roman conquest, and soon armed conflicts between the two powers started to happen. Such conflicts fueled several wars, known as the Punic Wars. The First Punic War took place between 264 and 241 BC. It was a maritime conflict for the most part, which forced the Romans to build a large fleet of ships to confront the Carthaginian warships. During the First Punic War, land battles were fought on the island of Sicily, a rather important strategic point for the control of trade in the Mediterranean Sea. The war ended with the Roman victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, fought between the Roman and the Carthaginian navy fleets. The Carthaginians were expelled from Sicily and other newly conquered territories. To ensure control of their borders, the Carthaginians were forced to sign a treaty recognizing Rome's right to lead the Mediterranean trade. The peace treaty between Rome and Carthage was tainted by a never-ending distrust between the two peoples. The Roman Senate always imposed new demands on taxes and territories, something that humiliated the proud Carthaginian people. Then, the great Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca focused his efforts on invading the Iberian Peninsula and conquering new lands for Carthage. Hamilcar had taken part in the last quarrels of the First Punic War, and, after the end of the war, he participated in the Mercenary War, where he fought a rebellion of mercenaries that ravaged Carthage's allied cities. Hamilcar defeated several Iberian tribes and took control of vast territories rich in silver and tin, adding a new source of income in metals and wood to Carthage. His name was exalted with grand esteem, something ill interpreted by the Romans. General Hamilcar looked at Rome with major contempt and instructed his eldest son never to trust the word of Roman senators and generals. Hamilcar's son was a determined and brave youngling, whose name will become known as one of history's greatest generals and military strategists, Hannibal Barca. The surname Barca can be translated as Ray, quite apt for the man Hannibal would become. In some versions, it's said that at the age of 9, Hannibal participated in a ritual alongside his father. During the ritual, Hannibal dipped one of his hands in a basin with the blood of a sacrificial animal, and as he raised his fist, young Hannibal took an oath in which he said, "I swear so soon as age will permit, I will use fire and steel to arrest the destiny of Rome." During his childhood, Hannibal studied writing and philosophy with Greek teachers and learned about the great military feats of Alexander the Great, while also learning military strategy from a Spartan teacher. The stories of Alexander's conquests were an inspiration for Hannibal to study battle tactics, quite unusual and risky, but which would be difficult for enemies to predict. The privileged education he had in his youth made Hannibal a man educated in different subjects, something that would be very useful in his military career. But an unexpected event changed Hannibal's life forever. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, died abruptly in 228 BC during a battle against Iberian rebels. Some years after his death, Hannibal was chosen to take the major role of army commander. At 26, Hannibal was a cunning commander, revered by his soldiers. Many admired Hannibal's resemblance to his late father. Some veteran soldiers even exalted Hannibal by saying, "He's Hamilcar in his youth, the same energy in his face, the same fire in his eyes." Hannibal extended his father's military campaigns against the Iberian tribes and defeated several enemy armies, conquering new cities and spoils for Carthage. Hannibal's reputation was already spreading among his people and reached the Roman Senate, which started to closely follow the young general's footsteps. To secure a monitoring point on the Iberian Peninsula, the Romans established a diplomatic alliance with the city of Sagunto, located where the province of Valencia in Spain is today. This strategic maneuver from the Romans was taken as a major insult by the Carthaginians, since Rome was claiming territories beyond the borders established in the old peace agreement. This offense against Carthage enraged General Hannibal, and he attacked the city of Sagunto. After an 8-month siege, the city was taken. The flames of war between Rome and Carthage were ignited again. Rome sent a political delegation to Carthage and demanded the return of Sagunto, along with a large sum of silver for the offense. But the Carthaginians had had enough of adding to the Roman resources. The Roman emissaries received an unexpected and bitter response. The Carthaginians chose war. After taking advantage of Hannibal's great popularity, the Carthaginian government urged the people and soldiers to start a new war against Rome. The Second Punic War began. For Hannibal, the long dreamed for chance to fight the Romans and honor the memory of his father had come. But he knew that Rome was not weak. A minor error could put everything to lose. Hannibal knew that the shortest way to Rome would be by crossing the Mediterranean Sea, landing with his troops in Italy. But many months were needed to build new boats. The Roman fleet was too strong to be challenged. To make matters worse, the Romans were already organizing their legions to move against Carthage. This invasion would be made by land through Spain and by sea from the island of Sicily. Hannibal then took one of the most daring decisions in history, to march against Rome across Spain and southern Gaul. Hannibal quickly assembled a large army, which included many horses, camels, and 40 war elephants that would have to be taken through uneven and unreceptive terrain. The long march began in late spring of 218 BC. Hannibal organized deployments of soldiers to protect the Iberian Peninsula during this absence, leaving Hasdrubal, his younger brother, in command of the troops. Even at the head of an army of more than 90,000 warriors, Hannibal knew that this would not be enough to defeat the legions and reach Rome. Then he sent messengers to recruit Iberian and Gaul mercenaries. Despite their mutual contempt of Rome, many tribes refused to send soldiers to support Hannibal's cause. After all, if the Carthaginian general failed in his attack, the Roman response would be quick and deadly. Nevertheless, about 40,000 Gauls joined Hannibal's army as they passed through Gaul. The rumors of the attack on Rome spread quickly. When the Romans learned of the advance of such a massive army, they readily established a line of defense and marched across the Mediterranean coast in the hope of stopping Hannibal's army in its tracks. To avoid a conflict that could greatly diminish his number of men, Hannibal changed his route and climbed the valley of the Rhone River, where he got new Gaul supporters. Now Hannibal had no chance of turning back. The Romans would chase him if he tried to retreat. There was no alternative but to forward by a new route. Hannibal's determination remained unshaken, but he was about to encounter the biggest obstacles in his military campaign: the Alps. A vast mountain range so high that they spent much of the year covered with snow due to the low temperatures. Even before a massive challenge, Hannibal did not step back and started what would be one of the most famous and dangerous journeys in history. The air grew colder as the autumn days passed, and Hannibal Barca felt restless in his military camp. Hannibal knew he needed to be quick to organize his risky march into the mountains. If it took too long, winter would come, and the passages would be blocked by snow. The Romans wouldn't stand still during the winter either, and they would certainly raise another army to fight Hannibal. Time would be a decisive factor in this war. To increase the chances of survival in his army, Hannibal hired some Gauls who inhabited the mountainous region and knew the treacherous passages that would be traversed. The Gauls warned Hannibal that it was too late to make the crossing, as winter would hit the men when they were on the march, but the Carthaginian leader was willing to take the risks, and Hannibal's long and torturous march through the Alps began in 218 BC. We don't know the routes used by the Carthaginian army because the Alps are full of passages, and there are no precise historical records of which one was chosen by the Gaul guides. The weather conditions and the mountainous terrain also make the work of archaeologists looking for concrete evidence difficult. One of the most accepted theories is that the Carthaginian army crossed a region known as the Little St. Bernard Pass, 2,188 meters high. Nowadays, it is on the border between France and Italy. Anyway, it is a great fact that a great army composed by Carthaginian, Numidian, Libyan, Iberian, and Gaul warriors was able to cross the inhospitable terrain. Besides the soldiers, there were hundreds of combat animals and cargo to carry the army supplies, such as food and material for the camps. But there was another danger in the mountains. Although the alpine terrain was not conducive to the proliferation of life, Some hostile Gaul tribes inhabited the lower, flatter regions of the mountains. Hannibal's army fell into an ambush by one of these tribes during the march. It suffered great losses, mainly cargo animals, as the mountain barbarians wanted to steal the weapons and armor carried. They were attacked by the tribe of the Cavares. Hannibal was able to quickly organize a line of defense and drove the enemies away, but that episode shook the morale of the Carthaginian army. 5 months had passed since Hannibal had left the Iberian Peninsula for Rome, and now many of his soldiers were dying in the Alps from fatigue, cold, hunger, and disease. It was late October, and snow was constantly falling on the army, and the situation was not good for Hannibal. To motivate his soldiers, Hannibal used his oratory talent and convinced his men that they were already close to the Padane Plain, a region to the west and east of Italy where the river Po passes. Motivated by the need to keep moving and the hope of quickly reaching flat ground, the soldiers continued their march, but the difficulties were still far from over. Many passages were blocked by large rocks or snow slides. Faced with this enormous challenge, Hannibal will have said one of his most famous phrases, "I shall either find a way or make one." Proving his genius, Hannibal ordered the soldiers to build great fires under the rocks and pour many liters of vinegar or wine on top. This would weaken the rocks, allowing the soldiers to break them more easily using common tools. Still on the long march, Hannibal and his army cross an extremely difficult point in the southern Alps, where much of the road is made up of steep cliffs and narrow trails. Many men and animals lost their balance and fell to their deaths amidst sharp rocks and freezing snow. After 16 endless days for the Carthaginian army, they finally reached the north of the Italian peninsula. But Hannibal and his soldiers had paid a high price for their passage through the Alps, losing almost half of their troops due to harsh weather conditions. An estimated 33,000 people died, including soldiers, horses, elephants, and pack mules. Hannibal organized a camp on the Padane Plain, where he allowed his soldiers to have a well-deserved rest. But he knew that the Romans quickly learned of his location and sent emissaries to seek new allies among the Gaul tribes of the region. Because they were closer to Rome, the Gaul tribes of the Padane Plain were forced to live under Roman rule, paying taxes and obeying the demands of their more powerful neighbors. This caused great discontent among the Gauls, and many began to join Hannibal's army. When the Romans were informed of the position of the Carthaginian army at the gates of Rome, they panicked because of the surprise. The Romans had lost track of Hannibal since he had changed his route towards the Rhone River. They believed he was still in Gaul or had returned to the Iberian Peninsula. Crossing the Alps during the winter was unimaginable. It was considered madness by most military commanders, but not for Hannibal Barca, who had now reached Italian soil. The Roman Senate quickly summoned the legions on the Iberian Peninsula and the island of Sicily, two routes where a Carthaginian attack was expected. The Roman legion situated in the Iberian Peninsula under the command of General Cornelius Scipio was the first to arrive in Italy, using many ships to transport the legionaries as quickly as possible. The first conflict between the Carthaginians and the Romans took place in the Battle of Ticinus, a battle fought essentially between the cavalry of the two armies, which ended with a great Carthaginian victory. During the battle, Cornelius Scipio was seriously wounded and survived thanks to his son who rescued him on the battlefield. Cornelius Scipio's son had the same name as his father, but would quickly become known as Scipio Africanus. Hannibal's victory won even more Gaul supporters for his army, which now had the numbers needed for the siege against Rome. In December 218 BC, the Battle of the Trebia took place between Hannibal's army and the Roman legions from Sicily. The battle took place near the river Trebia, where the Italian province of Emilia is now located. Like all great generals, Hannibal knew how to use the terrain to his advantage and planned an ambush against the Roman army. Hannibal had many Numidian knights, a people from North Africa who specialized in quick attacks with light cavalry. Hannibal ordered the Numidian cavalry to attack the Roman camp even before dawn. Once the legions responded to the attack, the Numidians were to retreat and lure the enemy near the river Trebia, where there would be Carthaginian troops hiding amongst the trees and bushes. Surprised and out of time to make the first meal of the day, the sleepy Romans reacted to the Numidian attack and took the bait from Hannibal. They were ambushed in a muddy terrain with little room for Roman formations. Some Roman troops tried to cross the river to reach Hannibal's camp, but the water made it difficult to move, and they became easy targets for the Carthaginian slingers and spearmen. The Roman army retreated to Hannibal's superior strategy, and the survivors fled in disarray, spreading the word that they were facing an unusual and extremely dangerous enemy. News of the Carthaginian victory did not take long to reach Rome, where fear spread rapidly among the population. But the Battle of the Trebia also had a price on Hannibal. After the battle, the Carthaginian army marched in a kind of pestilent swamp, which made many soldiers sick. Even Hannibal fell victim to a terrible infection in his right eye. Reports say that Hannibal was suffering from fever and pain, and that his eye was almost blind. Hannibal removed the damaged tissue and burnt it at the stake, a gesture that was seen with great admiration by his followers. There were several conflicts between the Carthaginian and Roman forces. Hannibal won the battles without suffering great loss, as in the Battle of Lake Trasimeno in the spring of 217 BC. Hannibal slowly advanced his army through Italian territory, but the Roman resistance was admirable. The war between Rome and Carthage was far from over. Hannibal Barca's invasion of the Italian peninsula had already cost many lives, but the Romans did not accept the surrender and continued to recruit new soldiers to defend Rome. Hannibal was forced to follow a route in eastern Italy to avoid rough terrain and stay away from the Roman legions. After months of stalemate, the fateful Battle of Cannae took place on August 2nd, 216 BC, a battle so brutal and disastrous that it is sometimes dubbed the Battle of Annihilation. To defend her city and defeat all invaders, Rome assembled the largest Roman army ever seen, with over 86,000 men against Hannibal's 56,000. Even at a numerical disadvantage, Hannibal drew up a risky plan where his troops were to surround the Roman legions and attack the enemy army's flanks. The battle began with Hannibal's initiative, using his heavy cavalry to defeat the Roman cavalry without difficulty, unprotecting the flanks and rear of the legions. The Romans continued to advance, believing in their superiority in numbers and their traditional tactics. They did not realize that the Carthaginian troops were slowly forming a half-moon around them. The Romans were caught in a classic pincer formation. They were punished on all sides, with no chance of retreating, as Hannibal's cavalry was in the rear. The result was a massacre. About 50,000 Romans were killed, 20,000 captured as prisoners. The Carthaginian army lost approximately 6,000 warriors, a low price for the huge victory against Rome. The Battle of Cannae was the greatest defeat in the history of the Roman Empire. Today, it is still studied by soldiers from all over the world. After that battle, nothing could stop Hannibal's advance against Rome. The Roman Senate ordered the city gates to close, but Hannibal did not seize the opportunity and decided to advance cautiously through Roman territory. He probably feared the existence of another Roman army hiding and ready to execute an ambush. Faced with Hannibal's indecision, one of his important commanders, called Maharbal, criticized the Carthaginian general, saying, "No man is blessed with all gifts of Baal. You, Hannibal, know how to win a victory, but you don't know how to use it. The Romans wasted no time and made a mass summons. They quickly created armies and whenever possible attacked Hannibal's camps, avoiding direct confrontation with the Carthaginian army. To make matters worse, Hannibal began to lose the support of the Carthaginian government, for many years had passed since Hannibal left for war. Hannibal constantly sent emissaries to Carthage asking for new reinforcements and supplies. But the fight against Rome was exhausting the city's coffers, and the response was not always positive. New battles were fought, and Hannibal conquered smaller cities like Capua and Taranto. But with each passing day, his military campaign was becoming unsustainable in the face of the incredible Roman ability to reorganize itself after each defeat. After almost 15 years of fighting Rome, Hannibal was called back to Carthage and withdrew from Italy in 203 BC. There are different reasons why the Carthaginian government demanded Hannibal's return. One is that the Carthaginian Senate feared that if Hannibal conquered Rome, he would advance against Carthage and begin a new empire. But the most likely reason was that Carthage needed Hannibal and his combat experience to be defended, as the Roman general Scipio Africanus had landed in Africa and was attacking and plundering the cities near Carthage. Hannibal already knew the fame of Scipio Africanus. According to some sources, he had also been in the terrible Battle of Cannae, one of the few survivors of that conflict. Scipio Africanus had gained experience over time and represented a great danger, as he liked to use unexpected tactics on the battlefield and no enemy could not manipulate him. Although Hannibal and Scipio admired each other, the confrontation between the two great generals was inevitable. In 202 BC, the famous Battle of Zama was fought. One day before the battle, Hannibal and Scipio organized a formal meeting where they discussed possible terms of peace, but could not reach an agreement that would please both parties. The battle began with an attack by Hannibal using his war elephants. The elephants roared across the plain between the two armies, a sight that would frighten any living being. But Scipio was prepared and ordered his army to blow hundreds of trumpets of war. The deafening noise caused the elephants to panic and stop. Some even turned around and advanced against the lines of the Carthaginian army. Few elephants reached the Roman army, but they were eliminated when they were hit by dozens of spears thrown by the legionaries. The attack of the Carthaginian elephants was a failure, and to Hannibal's surprise, his cavalry was being dominated by the cavalry mercenaries hired by the Romans. What was now left was the brutal hand-to-hand combat by soldiers on foot. Even Hannibal's veteran soldiers couldn't override the disciplined formations of Scipio's legions. While the infantry fought, the Roman cavalry attacked the Carthaginian flanks and rear, spreading panic among the Carthaginians, who quickly dispersed. The battle was over, and the great Hannibal Barca had been defeated. Hannibal returned to Carthage, where he declared that Carthage was defenseless and that they should accept any conditions imposed by the Romans to try to preserve their autonomy and protect their citizens. Scipio made numerous demands on the Carthaginians. Among them, Carthage could not wage war against any people without Rome's prior permission, nor could they train new war elephants or build a new naval fleet. Although these terms weakened Carthage enormously, they were accepted without much resistance by the Carthaginian Senate. After more than 20 years, the Second Punic War officially ended. Hannibal was about 46 years old when the war ended. In the following years, he had a political career where he was chief magistrate. 7 years passed, and rumors began to emerge that Hannibal was coming into contact with Antiochus III the Great, king of the Seleucid Empire, who dominated almost the entire Middle East and was an enemy of Rome. The Romans demanded that Carthage deliver Hannibal for his actions. But Hannibal went into exile, living in many cities such as Tyre, Antioch, Ephesus, and Crete. Always on the move, Hannibal still could not avoid the Romans, who bribed or threatened any kingdom that dared to welcome his hated enemy. Hannibal spent his last years of life in a city called Larissa, situated in the ancient region of northwest Asia Minor, where Turkey is today. Hannibal passed away between 183 and 181 BC, at about age 63 of age. It is believed that he committed suicide by poisoning, as the Romans would have found him again, and he was already tired of running away. Before he died, Hannibal would have left a letter where it said, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." The impact that Hannibal had on Roman culture would continue to be felt for many centuries. This figure caused so much terror that it gave rise to the phrase, "Hannibal is at the gates." This phrase is still used to express the anticipation of a calamity. The Romans felt a reluctant admiration for Hannibal, even building some statues of the Carthaginian general. The Second Punic War also showed the Romans that they would have to improve their war tactics. Using innovative military strategies could accelerate the process of conquering new territories. The story of Hannibal Barca has been retold in several books, films, and documentaries, and his life is full of glorious moments which are still remembered with admiration. Hannibal's personality and willpower are an inspiration to many who consider him an example of leadership and rebellion against an oppressive force. It is safe to say that if Hannibal had conquered Rome, he would have changed the course of history forever.